A long time ago, there was a family that lived happily in a small, quiet house in Poland. One day they learned that their grandparents were coming to live with them, and the child was so excited, and so were the parents. But the parents worried because their house was very small. They knew that when the grandparents arrived, the house would become crowded and much, much noisier. So the farmer went to ask the rabbi what to do. The rabbi said, "Let them come." So the grandparents moved in. They had a lot of furniture which went in the living room where they slept, and in some other rooms too. It was crowded and so noisy in the house. So the farmer went back to the rabbi. "I did what you said, Rabbi. Now my in-laws are here and it is really crowded and loud in our house." The rabbi thought for a moment, and then he asked, "Do you have chickens?" "Of course I have chickens," said the farmer. "Bring them into the house," said the rabbi. The farmer was confused, but he knew the rabbi was very wise. So he went home and he brought all of the chickens to live inside the house with the family. But it was no less crowded or noisy. In fact, it was worse with all the clucking and pecking and flapping. The farmer went back to the rabbi. "I did what you said, Rabbi. Now with my in-laws and the chickens, it's really crowded and so very loud in my house." The rabbi thought for a moment, and then he asked, "Do you have any goats?" "Of course I have goats," said the farmer. "Bring them into the house," said the rabbi. The farmer was confused, but he knew the rabbi was very wise. He brought in all of the goats from the barn to live inside the house. It was no less crowded and noisy, and in fact, it was much worse. The chickens were clucking and flapping, and the goats baaing and butting their heads against the walls and against each other. The next day, the farmer went back to the rabbi. "I did what you said, Rabbi. Now my in-laws have no place to sleep because the chickens have taken their bed. The goats are sticking their heads into everything and making a lot of noise." The rabbi thought, and then he said, "Aha, you must have some sheep." "Of course I have sheep," said the farmer. "Bring them into the house," said the rabbi. The farmer, confused, knew the rabbi was very wise. So he brought the sheep inside. It was no less crowded and noisy. In fact, it was much, much worse. The chickens were clucking and flapping. The goats were baaing and butting their heads. The sheep were baaing too. One sat on the farmer's eyeglasses and broke them. The house was loud and crazy, and it was starting to smell like a barn. Completely exasperated, the farmer went back to the rabbi. "Rabbi," he said, "I followed your advice. I've done everything you said. Now my in-laws have no place to sleep because the chickens are laying eggs in their bed. The goats are baaing and butting their heads. The sheep are breaking things. The house smells like a barn." The rabbi frowned. He closed his eyes and thought for a long time. Finally, he said, "This is what you need to do. Take the sheep back to the barn, take the goats back to the barn, take the chickens back to their coop." The farmer ran home and did exactly as the rabbi had told him. As he took the animals out of this house, his child and wife and in-laws began to tidy up the rooms. By the time the last chicken was settled in her coop, the house looked quite nice. And it was silent. The family agreed their home was the most spacious, peaceful, and comfortable home anywhere. I am one of 4 children. Growing up, the 6 of us lived in a huge, beautiful old house on a hill. The house was built in 1846 by a ship's captain and had creaks and groans that only a historic New England home with original wood floors could. My friends and I would have plays on a real stage in the attic, and our families would come and cheer, making us feel like Broadway stars. There were years that Iggy, a particularly nasty iguana that lived in the attic, brought home by my brother one day when his class pet needed a home. Iggy would spend days tearing around upstairs, slamming his tail into things, and we would sit and laugh downstairs as we heard my father in mortal verbal combat with the iguana. And by far, our most favorite evenings were those gathered around the TV together as we watched every single Boston Bruins game and cheered loudly for our team, always accompanied by my mother telling my father that if he continued to use his inappropriate words, she would shut off the TV and none of us would get to watch again. It was loud, it was crazy, and it was home. But I am the youngest child by quite a bit, and so by the time I was 8, all 3 of my siblings had left and gone their separate ways to college, and that huge old house on a hill filled with a silence I had never known. For 9 months out of the year, there were no 80s rock anthems blasting, no sounds of shrieking and laughing as my sister chased me around the family room table, nor the subsequent noise of my mother yelling at my sister when I needed to be taken to the emergency room afterwards. There were no sounds of my sisters bickering or my brother hitting hockey pucks against the garage. It was just silent. And with that silence came a feeling of sadness and a loneliness that I could not comprehend. So for years, decades really, I avoided silence completely. And the day before Sirius XM, I would drive to college 6 to 8 hours away and would spend the entire trip chasing the FM stations as I drove from state to state. I always had the TV on with constant background noise, so even if I was alone, I wasn't really, because Tom Brokaw or David Letterman or the cast of Friends were always there with even tones and a good laugh. To me, silence became synonymous with darkness and something to be avoided at all costs. Dr. Joan Harvey, a psychologist and researcher at Newcastle University, talks about the inability to stop the constant noise as comfort listening. She notes that comfort listening can act as both company as well as a kind of cognitive buffer, protecting us from unpleasant thoughts or feelings. When asked why silence can be so terrifying and uncomfortable to some, she explains that since our brains are hardwired to always seek an explanation, that silence can be filled with meaning. At times, she said, when we are confronted with a silence that is externally imposed, worldless, negative narratives prevent themselves, and the silence becomes dark and scary. I wonder what conclusions the researcher would have drawn if she had spent time in a synagogue. To be perfectly honest, I never truly understood the concept of noise until I began working here full time. The phones ring, people come in and out. There's so much to do all at once, and at the same time, there's real life. People dealing with pain, with illness, with sadness, and amazing events like weddings and babies and beyond. But sometimes it's hard to think because there are so many sounds all at once. However, silence is a critical component of our daily Jewish rituals. Through them, we take time out from our noisy lives to pray in near silence. And if through those prayers we're lucky enough to reach a sort of spiritual connection, it's at that moment when we become wrapped in our own cocoon of silence, alone with God. In that way, Judaism teaches silence is the tool for drawing ourselves closer to God in this physical world. Over 3,000 years ago, in the morning God gave the Jewish people the Torah, we're taught that the entirety of creation was silent. All life forms were quiet. The sea was completely still. Nothing moved, not a sound, pure silence. And it was from the Torah that this silence was given. Each Jew standing at Sinai was forced to look into his heart and come to terms with themselves without the aid of anything external. No iPhones, no iPads, not even a beeper. The Midrash teaches that on that day, God's voice boomed with an intensity and a strength that had never before been revealed. That voice was so powerful that it penetrated the heart of every single person standing at Sinai, and yet not a single sound was heard. God spoke to each heart in the most personal way. Each person was chosen by God to become the recipient of the Torah, the greatest treasure in the world. The dictionary defines silence as being the absence of noise, not so the Torah. The Torah defines silence as being the key to a positive and healthy relationship with God and with ourselves. Not so long ago, I stumbled upon a documentary entitled "The Man with No Legal Identity." The subject is Titus Morris, a 33-year-old from Liberty, Kentucky, who lives completely off the grid. I tuned in because I was intrigued by what prompted a young, bright guy to buy a 50-acre property and live a completely simple life. Before the cold weather sets in, Titus goes barefoot. He sustains himself solely on a self-grown, plant-based diet without consuming dairy or eggs. He keeps his food cold in a creek that runs through his property. Though he lives close to the Amish community, he is not a part of it. He has no running water, electricity, or internet, but his personality is infectious, and the more I watched, the more I began to grow a bit envious of his life. As he rides his horse through the dirt roads, you can actually feel the wind blowing through the trees, the dogs barking, and the clipping of his horse's hooves. With the Appalachian Mountains as the backdrop, Titus is asked, "You don't really tune into the news, do you?" Titus thinks for a moment and answers, "I hear people talk, and I'm interested in knowing what's going on around me and in the world. But there's a point where you take in all of this negative information and you can't stop it. So why constantly feed yourself the negative?" He continues, "All of this negative information is like a junk food diet. If you're constantly feeding yourself negative, 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 it will wear you down and make you sick, mentally, emotionally, physically. But if you focus on what's right in front of you, the beauty that God made, this cool breeze that God made, the food that God gave us that's healthy and nutritious, the clean air that we breathe, there's so much positive that we can think about and we can be thankful. It will change our mental outlook to where we're thinking positively. And then, if we're healthy emotionally, it will help us be healthy physically as well." This simple statement got me thinking, what if I could change the narrative of my silent moments? What if instead of darkness, I allowed that silence to help bring in light to my soul? This Day of Atonement is a day for thinking about turning, teshuvah, both turning away from what we want to distance ourselves from and turning toward what we seek, pointing ourselves in a new direction in the new year. The scholar Maimonides argued that the only starting point for teshuvah is silent and internal. True repentance, he wrote, begins with a quiet process of sifting through not only our memories of the past year, but also our thoughts, treasuring the good and flagging any that clash with our highest values. When we discover those moments of goodness, it can help us shift our view of ourselves, seeing the very best of what we can be. And finding moments of separation between who we want to be and who we have been creates a shock of recognition. We suddenly realize how far we may have traveled from the path we know we should be taking. For Maimonides, speaking the words of the al-Chet without having gone through the silent process of taking stock of ourselves is like going to the mikveh while carrying a pig. It's just not going to work. To really move towards repentance, said Maimonides, we have to silence our words and even silence our internal monologues so that we can listen to what our heart is telling us. About 6 months ago, I got a call that would change my life. Close friends, family really, were in a horribly unimaginable situation, and there's no way I could help. I desperately wanted and needed to do something, but I had no skills to give. Feeling distraught and at a loss, I did the one thing that I know how to do. I came in here, I stood in front of those Torahs, and I prayed. I spoke to God, I cried, I yelled, I pleaded, but mostly I kept quiet and let my heart do the talking. I remembered Titus and his assertion that sometimes the noise can feel like you've ingested a smorgasbord of junk food, leaving a sore stomach and an aching head. So I stopped talking and I began to just listen. And as I did, I felt myself being embraced and comforted by the silence that this room, these Torahs, provided. I haven't stopped. And every early morning I come in here, even if just for a few minutes, and sit with our Torahs in silence. I have learned that the heart, like God at Mount Sinai, needs silence in order to speak. Jews have been teaching for centuries that God is both the powerful creator of all and the still, small, hard-to-hear voice within us. Too often we refuse to hear that voice, refuse to give it any airtime because it can be too painful to listen to. On Yom Kippur, we have the opportunity to be silent in order to hear the voices of those we may have wronged or neglected during the past year, as well as the voices of those we may have loved and helped. Silence can teach us where we have done right and where we have gone wrong, and it can give us the humility to be able to hear the other voices that strain to reach our ears, the voice of our hearts, the voices of those around us, and the voice of God within us. Silence can allow us to take the first steps toward turning and returning, turning away from destructive paths, turning toward the good, returning to others, and returning to ourselves. It all begins with the silence that allows us to hear the truth that dwells within us. We read in the book of Kings, God is found not in the wind, nor in the earthquake, nor in the fire, but in a still, small voice. This year, may we find true growth and comfort from the silence. May our loud thoughts be quieted and our brains be allowed to rest. Though the silence may sometimes unsettle us, please, God, allow waves of your peace and presence to wash over us. Gamar Chatima Tova.